Hi everyone, Coach Brodie here with you once again from Human Vortex Training, your certified and experienced USA Cycling expert level coach and strength and conditioning coach. Today we are going to talk about why here at Human Vortex Training we don't really use a 20-minute functional threshold test for most of our athletes and why you probably shouldn't be using it either. All right, so we're actually re-recording this as we had some really great comments and beginning of conversations down in the comments from last week's video. So what we're going to do here first is answer those two individuals who posted, and actually these are the starts of the conversations that I want to have here on the HVTraining YouTube channel. So the first is from Philip. He said, thanks for the thorough breakdown. I was just wondering, how do you compute the actual FTP from a 2 by 10 minute effort? The power you can put out is going to be higher than if you just did 1 by 20 minutes, right? So yes, Philip, that is correct. And what we'll do here is, again, we're going to smooth this data out. And what we're going to do is we're going to take about 90 to 95%, depending on how advanced the rider is. So the more advanced the rider is, the higher the number, the percentage that we're going to take from this, because what that does is allow us to see what the rider would actually be able to put out over the course of a 20-minute effort. Now, that being said, remember, as we look at this, as the rider becomes more advanced, one, the power numbers will be much more repeatable, so we're going to see better repetition. Number two, because the hormonal, cardiorespiratory, neuromuscular systems are all, and the metabolic systems are all being trained properly through our strength training and our on-bike training, we're going to see less fluctuation as we go up and down, especially if we look at the cadence. We're going to see it kind of smooth out quite a bit more. So we're looking for, out of these 2 by 10 minutes, Philip, we're not looking for the stronger of the two efforts. Now, some of you are going to go, what? My head is blown. Why wouldn't you take the higher of the two? Because what we're looking for is the most repeatable and the most consistent. So if we actually look at which was more consistent here, we'll see that the second effort was a tiny bit more consistent than the first. So if we actually go in, we trim this down, we're going to see that for 10 minutes and 2 seconds, 232. We'll call this FTP number 2. And the reason I'm doing this live with you here, well, live on the recording, is because I want you to see the process that we actually go through here to understand how exactly we come to these numbers, because this is an incredibly important part. It's not an exact science. A lot of this is going to come down to feel, and as we'll see with the other commenter, this is important that you see all of the data and understand what exactly is going on. So FTP number 1, roughly 228. We do see that number 2 is about 4 watts higher. When we do the math, Philip, we're going to do 232 times 0.95. Remember, this is a highly experienced masters athlete who has many years of racing in his legs, and he knows his body well. So that's how we're going to take it from the 2 by 10. For beginners, Philip, we will actually start with a 2 by 8 minute functional threshold test with 8 to 12 minutes rest and recovery in between. And again, we're looking at how are they recovering power-wise, heart rate-wise, cadence-wise in between these efforts. So if we take the speed out here for just a moment, we see that in between the efforts, the cadence doesn't change too much. And this is something with this athlete we've been working on for quite some time, is giving him more cadences in his toolbox. And again, this is in the middle of the season. So we were actually coming back off of a break, and we were just getting ready for a time trial effort. I think it was a 20-minute time trial that summer on the end of July, if I'm not mistaken. So this athlete did a fantastic job over the next couple of weeks of cleaning up his cadences and sticking to different tools for different efforts. So that should answer that question. So we'll use not the higher of the two. In this case, it happens to be the higher of the two, but that's not always the case. We're going to look for the one that is more consistent. Now, the next comment that we're going to answer is one that I was really hoping someone would put up, and I was really, really happy to see actually that someone did comment on this. And this is why I actually purposefully chose these two files. Now, the first one we're going to talk about, it's the same person. They replied in about 10 minutes within one of another, something like that. So the second comment was, this video is very bad, and you analyze the person as a total beginner. No way that spike and all that effort is bad. So my inclination was actually this is a female domestic professional, thinking that they were talking about the 200 watt, which they had put up at the beginning. And then I asked, why do you think the video is bad? What information here is not useful? This is a conversation that as cyclists and especially as coaches, we must be having. In this video, the whole point of it is to take a non-ideal, non-regular cycling power file, and believe it or not, these are far more regular than you would believe, the Cyclists SK. Like, these are what you're going to see. I've been doing this for almost 15 years. I've assessed who knows how many files at this point, probably between 50 and 100,000 power files. These are consistent with what you are going to see with real, actual cyclists out in the world. You are not going to see what we're going to look at next, which is a professional male and what they're able to put out. Now, the first comment he put up, or she, was 200 watt FTP test, beginner. So this, I chose that on purpose because women in sport of cycling, first of all, they're not getting enough races. The purses are not there. I've been a huge proponent of women's cycling since I first started Human Vortex training. I personally find the women's racing, the road racing, the criterium is much more cerebral. It's much more tactical and it's much more fun to watch. And it's a harder sport to exceed at. But because there's such a small pool of women, in large part because our training approaches into how to train our females versus males are still so far behind what they actually need. And in fact, as we're re-recording this, it's Tuesday, the 7th of January, which is a lot closer to launch than I'd like. But I actually posted in a response to an NSCA long-term athletic development special interest group, someone posted a difference between male and female prepubescent boys and girls and how you need to build their long-term athlete development for speed and agility. And in the study they posted, they don't make a marker of difference or differentiation or no mention at all between the male and female hormonal status, which changes at that critical time point when we're looking at going to level 2 of speed and agility. So I made a comment in there and had back and forth, a positive back and forth with the individual there because nothing is mentioned in that study. And I said, we don't know. This is also when the hormonal statuses change. We'll talk about that in another video. Or if you'd like to hear more about that, I was recently on the Mike Robertson Physical Preparation podcast at the end of 2019. So you can take a listen to that. I believe it was episode, I think 69 or 70, if I'm not mistaken. But you can look that up. Physical Preparation podcast with Mike Robertson. And the last 15 or 20 minutes, I really get into the differences between men's and women's training. Now, I'm going to address the second comment from the Cyclists K, and that is this video is very bad. And you analyze the person who is a total beginner, no way spiking all that effort bad. So we're going to close that out. And the important thing here is 5, 10, 15 years ago when I first started, I'd get really pissed off. Like, let's just be honest about it. Let's call it what it is. I'd say, what is this person talking about? They have no clue what's going on. But now, having been up on stage and given presentations to coaches and athletes around the world, we don't know what we don't know. So here is the important thing. This is why it's important to ask questions as opposed to make statements. So first of all, this is not a beginner. Again, this is a master's athlete who has been racing since the 1980s, competitively, Category 2, Category 1 in the US. So we're talking about over 30 years of racing. This guy knows his body well. He's incredibly in tune to what's going on, and he is a hell of an athlete. And considering how he's trained, these numbers are actually incredibly, incredibly good. Now, here's what you did not see. As I mentioned in the last video, I did not include the elevation gain, but I mentioned that this was done at the Bud Harris cycling track in Pittsburgh. So if you don't know the track, and if you're a coach coaching an athlete somewhere else, you need to make sure that you are asking the important questions. Just opening a power file and looking at the power and heart rate is not going to tell you what is going on with the athlete. You can't do that. I know a lot of coaches nowadays are looking for decoupling between the power and the heart rate, especially when it comes to the stride power meter for running. You cannot look at only that data. You need to see the whole picture. And I purposefully left this out because I wanted to have this conversation, because a lot of people nowadays, a lot of coaches are just going online, starting online. I started in person. I didn't approach the online coaching place world until after about 5 years of coaching real athletes in person. Now, that's my personal approach, but I can tell you without a doubt that the number of athletes who have come to me after working with a coach online who has next to no experience except for just themselves, they have very poor outcomes for the most part. There's always exceptions. And I'm not saying this to point fingers. What I am saying is that as coaches, we cannot just look at the data on the screen and think we know what's going on. You have to take a step back and ask yourself, what am I missing here? What do I not see or do I not know that might be going on with this athlete? So when we take a step back and we actually look at these spikes in power, I know this track extremely well, and I also had a conversation with this athlete because I was not happy with how big those spikes were. Now, here's what we're going to see. As we zoom in to these, we are going to see two unique things happen. Number one is we're going to pop the miles per hour on here. We're going to show this because what I want to point out here is that we would expect that on the Bud Harris cycling track, when the athlete is coming up on the back end, we're going to see a spike in power, but we're going to see a big increase in power. And if it's a good day at the track, we're going to see their speed on the straightaway going to be higher than on the home stretch. And that is not what we see. So what this means is that this athlete, for each lap that they're doing, they are fighting a headwind, which is why we have a spike in power here on the back stretch, but on the home stretch, they have a tailwind, and yet they need to go up over hill. So there is a separation between the power spikes and the spikes on the actual elevation gain. This is incredibly important. If you do not ask the right questions, you are going to look at this file, especially if it's your first time working with this athlete, and go, wow, they're a complete beginner. I know he said he's been riding for a while, but maybe he hasn't actually been racing. And you need to have an in-depth, very intelligent conversation with that athlete to figure out what was going on that day at that time in their riding. So there are a lot of questions that needed to be asked. Instead of just making a statement, this is bad, very bad. Actually, this athlete did a fantastic job. You'll actually notice the speed on the second one. He did a fantastic job of really adjusting for the winds. And again, this is one of the other reasons why doing two efforts instead of one is going to allow you to see better results. The athlete is going to have to use their brain and figure out, how can I do better? Yes, I know my average power needs to be higher, but I'm training for a time trial on this track in this particular case, which I did not disclose before, but even irregardless of that, we want maximal power and maximal speed when we're doing FTP. We don't just want maximal power, because as you'll see in some of the upcoming videos, or if you have taken the HVTraining, strength training for cycling certification, you'll see a ton of videos, or a couple videos of athletes who are putting out all the power, air quotes, and they are all over their bike on the trainer. If they try to do that on the road, number one, they're a hazard to themselves. They're going to get hit by a car if they're training by themselves because they have no control over the bike. Number two, if they're in a group, the group is going to try and lose them because they are dangerous on the road. So you need to make sure you have all the information. When we do these two different efforts, as you go through for yourself or you go through for your athlete, you need to ask the hard questions. You need to think, what am I missing here? What don't I know? So let's close this window out. Let's go to what the individual, the spikes, was saying, 200 watts, beginner. Actually, that was for a domestic professional female that we saw before. She weighed around 51 kilograms. She might be a little bit lighter at that time, but that's what I had on record. So her watts per kilo at 200 watts was actually 3.9. 3.9 watts per kilo. It's not the number that you see on the screen that matters. As Jim Carrey will tell us here in a second, there's a difference between absolute and relative.
You know about the relative and the absolute, right? The relative is the things you relate to, and the absolute is the truth of consciousness being everything.
I love Jim Carrey as an actor. Now, the absolute and relative he talks about doesn't really have much to do with power, but that's the answer for most coaches when I say, well, what's the relative? And we go, well, it's 200 watts. How much did they weigh? Were they going into headwind? Were they with a tailwind? There are all these other questions that you need to ask and figure out. So with this athlete, 3.9 watts a kilo. It was end of season, if I'm not mistaken, or going into the season rather. It was still early, not her best effort. We really dialed things down. 3.9 watts a kilo at 200 watts. I don't care who you are, you're going to drop people off your wheel. It is the absolute number, the most absolutely important? Absolutely not. The relative is. So do not look at a power file and think, 158 watts, beginner. Maybe they weigh 40 kilos. 220 watts, whatever. Yeah, whatever. Okay, then we need to put out major power. Come on, guys. You need to be smarter than that. You are smarter than that. Don't take the data at face value. And this isn't to call the person out. This is a teaching point, because this exact exchange has happened numerous times out in public, and people just get upset and start calling names. It's not about that. We're here to learn. That's what this whole YouTube channel is about. It's helping you become a smarter, stronger, and more savvy cyclist and triathlete. That's the name of our podcast as well, the Strong, Savvy Cyclist and Triathlete podcast. So let's get into what this user would have wanted to see, because they want to see big power numbers. Okay, so that's what we're going to jump into here. So this is an athlete I was working back in, this is October 2012. This was actually year number 5 that we were working together, and he came to me as a true beginner. And unfortunately, as I tried to access my VMware, it appears that my external hard drive imploded and I can't get anything off of it. So I don't have his early power files, but I can tell you they looked very similar to what we saw with that female domestic professional rider, where it was a lot of spikes, a lot of incongruencies throughout, and he really came a long way. The season that was a breakthrough for him was 09 to 10, when we actually, I said to him, hey dude, how much do you not care about what people think? He's like, well, if it's going to make me faster, I'm for it. Like, it's not illegal or anything. Like, cool, let's do it. I said, all right. We're going to put a triple chain ring on your bike, and you're going to be spinning at a cadence of 95 plus for the next 3 months. That's all I want you to do. People can zip ahead of you on the climbs, but I want you at a cadence of 95 plus, because we're working on your core stability. We were doing some of the stuff that we'll show in a upcoming video here on the YouTube channel. And we were working on neuromuscular, and guess what? He came out and crushed it the next year. I mean, just a completely new rider, but the amount of jabbing he took was massive. So this is a true professional rider in all the senses. Excellent rider and a lifelong friend. So here we're going to look at what he did here. This is an indoor ride. This is actually a 20-minute. We did get to that point with him where we were ready for and able to do a 20-minute because it was appropriate for him. You'll see that this is set up on a trainer. But guess what? He did what was best for him. And this is where the client and athlete relationship, there needs to be rapport and trust developed between the two of you. And I see too many new coaches saying to athletes, no, you're doing it my way or the highway. Certainly there are times and places for that, but that is not going to be every single ride. So what we see here, remember what we talked about in the athlete who had the 20-minute, the triathlete, middle distance, doing half Ironman and half Ironman races. We saw her warm up was boom, 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 up, down, up, down, up, down. Very poor warm up. Here we see this athlete just rock it. 72 beats per minute, just chilling out. Look at this, like 80, 85 watts, less than 100 watts, except for a little bit of a bump up here. I'm sure this was adjusting on the saddle, getting out of the saddle. Look at how beautiful his heart rate is as he goes up. That is a wonderfully done 5-minute warm up. We're talking about getting deep blood flow, slowly raising the internal temperature of the body, getting the muscle temperature up as well, getting the capillaries ready, getting the nervous system fired up. So his first 5 minutes is beautifully done. Now, again, I must stress that this was year number 4 or 5 working with this athlete at that point. So we really worked a lot together. He asked a ton of questions, always curious. It was always a conversation, and sometimes like, yeah, totally. Okay, let's do it that way and see how it goes. And then, hey, you know what? I think we should do this. Well, tell me why you think that. It was a conversation. That's how you coach people. That's how you make them better. So now we see a nice little ramp up. So for the next 5 minutes, now he's coming up 273, spikes a little bit. Now we see the heart rate is ready to go. Now, if he was impatient or he didn't understand the importance of a nice solid warm-up, we would see him rocket right into this. But he's a smart rider. He's a very good rider. So he understands, hey, I'm going to sit here. I'm going to get a good feel on the bike. I want to get a good feel for the pedals. You see the power comes back down. He's settling back in. You can see the heart rate spikes a little bit. I'm guessing that probably is going to go with standing out of the saddle a little bit. Let's see, 92. Yep, just a little bit. So there, yeah. So he's standing. That's what we're going to take from the RPMs and seeing them drop. He's going to stand. It doesn't necessarily correlate directly, but it looks like it. So then what happens is he gets into his fast pedals. So we did 5-minute fast pedals here. We're just going to take a look at this. You can see he does a really nice job. Look at that cadence. He's pushing around the 117, 120, which for him is pretty easy. Like he's not really getting into the 130s, 140s, but he feels comfortable. The power is relatively smooth. I'm not super concerned for someone at his level with the power for the fast pedals. We're much more concerned, is he solid in the saddle? Is maintaining? Is he staying nice and smooth and relaxed on the pedals? Or is he bouncing around? So we see, he's putting out some pretty good power, 247. When it comes to fast pedal, when it comes to developing your actual power, your ability to pedal smooth, the ability to push down the pedal with the opposite leg is smoothing out. This is another reason why I like these fast pedals in the warm-up. For any functional threshold test, it really allows you to get into things and to progress. And we see the second one, the power drops a little bit and he brings it up a gear. That's okay. I'll buy that. 117, he's going to pop out around 120 towards the end, 118, nice and smooth. We see the heart rate response is appropriate, drops nice and quickly. Again, this is the beginning of base. So he had some time off. We see some fantastic response, and look at that heart rate. Look at how beautifully that comes back down, and he nails it between 100 and 115 beats per minute. This right here, ladies and gentlemen, if you can replicate just one part of this ride, forget the rest of it. If you can replicate your warm-up, maybe you're not going for 20 minutes or 15 minutes until your first fast pedal. Maybe you're doing 8 minutes. If you can replicate this for heart rate and power as you go through that slow ramp up, giving your body time to warm up, really warm up, and allowing yourself to take these first 10 minutes and really replicating this in your warm up, you are going to see a very subtle but significant shift in your abilities to put power out later in the ride. So we're going to speed up a little bit because we got a lot more to cover here. We have 3 more files we're going to look at. Here we're going to see the rider. This is the power that the rider, Spike Siskay, was looking for. 445 watts. We see a couple of spikes in through here where he's standing, ramping the power up. We see that power come up. So this rider is putting out significant power. I mean, he's somewhere, I'm going to say for this, he was probably... he's about 2 months off peak. So I think during the season, if I'm not mistaken, he was putting out somewhere around 470, 475. Although it's been a while since I've looked at these numbers, but this is down significantly over what he had been doing in the season. Now, if I remember his weight correctly, I think what we were looking at, let's see, I think he was around 72, so 6.18 watts per kilo, something like that. I could be wrong on that. Probably am wrong, but this was what I'm guessing you wanted to see Spike Siskay. I mean, that's right, high power. That's what a professional is. Again, it's all relative to body weight. So after the 5 minute, we see, look at this. Look at how beautifully he backs off the power. It doesn't go to 0, 57, soft pedals, hits 125, 135 as he ramps back up. This is what we want to see in your recovery. Look at that heart rate, 110, 110. Now he's getting ready to warm up, 125. He's getting ready for that next effort. He's getting ready to push, and then he bumps into that 20 minute. Now this 20 minute, we can see where he stands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times throughout the 20 minutes. You'll notice that his cadence drops off, but his power is remaining relatively steady. Different tools in the toolbox, and this is why I reserve the 20-minute efforts for the more advanced riders. He's able to produce relatively stable power throughout. We have 1 or 2 little chinks in here, but remember, it's coming after a transition, somewhere between 10 and 14 days off the bike, no training really. Maybe he was mountain biking, I don't remember. This is quite some time ago. We're talking 10 years ago at this point, or 8 years ago rather. So it's quite a long time ago, but look at the tools that he is using to allow him to be able to do better. We also see lower cadences here, high That's the fast pedal. This is a little bit lower. See, lower. Now he's coming high. Different tools that he's using to maintain that power all the way through. No big spikes at the beginning, a little bit when he stands here, but he understands how to pace himself. Look at the heart rate. We're not seeing that big up scoop like we saw with the triathlete where they really pushed hard at the end and had nothing left in the tank. This is what we want to see your athletes kind of do. Ideally, as we went through, as you'll see here, we get into September, going back, this was outdoor. We actually see things kind of, back down. He was at 31-minute steady state about a month before, almost to the day, actually. So 370 was his 30-minute here. For our test, and then we go back to September and 324, but this is outdoors dealing with terrain and climbing. You'll also notice that his ability to deal with the terrain through the cadences was actually pretty fantastic. If we really take a look at that, look at how nicely he deals with this. Yeah, he's getting out of the saddle. We'll see a little bit of power drop, but he's doing a nice job of using his cadences. We see, appropriate drop off. He's pushing around 70 to 75 watts, which is something we had worked on at that time for climbing, a little bit more of what I call Carmichael tempo pedal stroke, but we worked on being solid in the saddle. Look at his power stays nice and steady. Goes to spin up a little bit to accelerate and able to come right back. This is not where most of your athletes are going to be. If we look at the spikes in here and we take them and look at the changes in cadences, the changes in the terrain, this is really well done by this athlete. This is not something you are going to be able to see with a beginner or even an intermediate cyclist. And again, this is a 30-minute steady state effort. And I do not recommend you use these. Now, this was the end of a workout. You can see we didn't do any of this lactate threshold stuff until an hour, 45 minutes into his ride. So this is the end of the season. We're polishing things up. We're getting ready. This is after he had 5 times 30 seconds all out. We had a little bit of climbing. Look at that terrain he's climbing. Nice and steady, staying right in essentially tempo as he goes through different cadences because he knows he has that steady state. This, again, is why we don't use a 20-minute FTP with most of our athletes here. They just cannot do it. They don't have the ability to properly pace themselves and go through and allow them to really go out and push as they need to in order to go through and build their abilities. Now, if we take a look at about a week and a half before, now you're going to say, well, wait a minute, Brodie, you say you don't use a 20-minute steady state, but here you have the athlete testing on the 18th, and on the 3rd, just 2 weeks and a day before, you had them doing something similar outdoors. What's going on? I thought you don't like this. I do and I don't. Again, this is an advanced rider. Look at the pacing here. This is right after, I think he was on the bike for about 2 weeks at this point after his break. And you can see it's down sloping. We don't want to see that with the big spike at the end. So let's zoom in here on this 20-minute FTP. And then afterward, he just had some endurance. So let's zoom in on this and let's look at what's going on here. So we see terrain, but he doesn't deal with it as well as he does in about 2 weeks. That's because the organism, the rider, has gone through a transition period appropriately, still putting out really good power, 375 for this, and we're able to see him, he's putting out 400. In his notes, he said, I didn't want to go any higher. He had done 475 a couple of weeks earlier, if I'm not mistaken, for a 5-minute power. So let's go back and look at this. I'm sorry, it was 15 days later he did the 5-minute power, 445. My apologies. So he understood. He said, I just wanted to hit 400 in my 5-minute, just enough that I would feel good. I wanted to do it on a climb. This is the climb I used. This is why I did it. I PR'd on it. Inconsequential to the ride, but nice to have. It was a King of the Mountain for that on Strava. And we see here, he also talked about the 20-minute and how he felt good, but towards the end, he could feel the power was fading a little bit as they got up to the top. But look at that heart rate. So now we see the heart rate's dropping a little bit. It means that neurologically or mentally, he's backing off of the gas just a little bit as he comes to the end of that 20-minute all out. So if we go back to Philippe's question, if we look at this 20-minute effort, even though it's an all out and he's really pushing at 375, I do not like this number nearly as much as the one that he put out on the 18th, about 15 days later for a half hour, because the half hour is much more steady. Granted, this was done on a trainer. when we're looking at how an athlete is able to respond to a climb, this isn't exactly what we want to see. However, in transition, that's normal. We're not going to be able to put ourselves in the box as much. We're not going to be as highly motivated. This was just go out, let's see what you can do, and then we're going to have the actual field test in about 2 weeks. So we didn't know exactly when the date was. We built it off of his TSB, if I'm not mistaken. We knew it was going to be the end of October, but we didn't have an exact date. We went based on what he felt because this was not ideal. And we both knew that. We had a conversation and we determined together. Now, if we go and we look at that athlete, the domestic professional, and how she was able to build into that FTP at 200, we can actually see that she did some over-unders about 2 months before that, where she averaged 232. Now, the over-unders, this is where we're flaunting the line. We're going under lactate threshold and then over. And you can see that for this athlete, it was not as clean as we would have liked. But guess what? It's outside. This is in Southern California, Orange County. So we're going through and looking at the terrain, and this is where, as a coach, as someone that's reading through everything that we're going over, we really need to understand what the full picture is that we're looking at. So we can actually see here as we smooth it out. And I don't like generally going more than about halfway with the smoothing because you lose a lot of that important detail. We can see here the athlete has a big drop off each time, right around the 8-minute mark. And that was for each of the segments, right? 7:49, every single effort we see she kind of drops off, and that's why we had done these efforts. So if we smooth that out, see, we miss a little bit, 6 minutes. So then we get in, she has a big drop here, 5 minutes. So this is the VO2 max energy system, 8 minutes. Again, this is the VO2 max energy system not being able to keep up its end of the bargain, so to speak. And we see it dropping at 8, then at 5, then even less. I think this was 4 something. Is that right? 4. So we see a weakness in the VO2 max energy system being able to shift over with these changes in terrain. Do you think that's going to affect her racing a little bit? Yeah, just a lot. Now, that's not to say that this was a bad ride. What that is to say is that by doing repeated efforts instead of one, I could have, had I been more traditional, or maybe 10 years ago, 11 years ago, 12 years ago when I started in my cycling coaches, 12 years before this, I probably would have had her doing sweet spot for like 15 minutes, 2 by 15 minutes and calling it a day. We get far more data by going through a workout like this, where we're isolating and calling out a specific energy system that we saw a weakness in that rider's race file. So I'm not going to pull that up because the video is already getting a little bit long here. But if you go back to that first why I don't use a 20-minute FTP video, you'll see exactly where she breaks down is around the 6 to 8 minute mark. And that's why these types of tests are important. It's not a matter of just getting the maximum power to get the maximum power. You have to be able to take a step back, understand that there are 4 pillars for athletic progression. And there's actually a nice video that I did about 3 years ago called Exercise Science, How Your Fitness Actually Progresses. And that video is actually a reply to a more popular YouTuber who actually put out, well, your fitness over time is just through riding. And I didn't call them out by name, and they probably still don't know who it is, and you probably still don't know who it is. But that video had been out for a couple years and had a lot of comments and people following it, and it is not scientific. It's not coming from a coaching background. It's coming from what that rider felt is their own experience. I can't argue with that. If that rider felt that their consistency is how their fitness built over time by adding more miles and more time on the bike, who am I to argue with that? However, when I'm looking at what's going to work for the masses, everybody is different. And we talk about this a lot on the Strong, Savvy Cyclist and Triathlete podcast. It depends. However, the 4 pillars for athletic progression are pretty much at this point in time in 2020 inaugural. You can't argue with it because it's neuromuscular, metabolic, hormonal, and cardiorespiratory. Those 4 pillars need to be built together to allow the athlete to progress. What if I told this athlete that these efforts were not good enough because her power was too high or too low? She saw too many spikes up and above. We're missing the whole neuromuscular component. Look at this. Look at how her cadence fades. Does that not tell you that we need to work on strength endurance? This is not a matter of going into the gym and doing tons of lunges and leg presses and hamstring curls. No, we're talking about getting them in the gym and understanding how to produce core stabilization. And we're not talking about front planks. Please go over to the Human Vortex Training blog, read my first blog post for 2020 on planks and how you're missing out on a lot of what you need. And then make sure you are liking and subscribing, because we're going to release a video here in a couple weeks. I'm going to share with you my 6-minute daily routine, which not only helped me, has helped versions of it, have helped hundreds, if not thousands of athletes around the world come back from back pain, not being able to ride their bike, hip pain, or just to be able to ride fitter, faster, and stronger. Now, what that video is my specific routine, but it doesn't get into the minutia of what you would need to do, but we'll talk about that in that video. So, I hope you found this video to be useful, and there's a lot. I know this is a long video. I know the last one was long, but as you can see, there is so much to talk about beyond the power numbers themselves. And it's not absolute power. It is relative power. It is the shape of the power interval. It is the ability of the athlete to use different tools in their toolbox. And you can see he's neuromuscularly fatiguing here as well, to be able to maintain their effort over a given time. It's understanding what is the terrain that the athlete is riding over. Was there a headwind? Was there a tailwind? Was there one of their brakes clamped down by accident because somebody at the start line saw it was open and meant well, but it actually was not to how the athlete had built the bike? There are so many considerations that we must take as coaches and an athlete while we're looking at our power files. Do not make the beginner mistake, or maybe make it, but learn quickly from it, that just looking at absolute power and disregarding all of this other information. Let's just do this. Hide others. Great. How is my power file? Well, it's really spiky and I need to fix that. Well, how's my heart rate? I don't know. Heart rate doesn't matter. Well, actually, yes, it does. Well, what about the terrain? The terrain doesn't matter, does it? Well, actually, it really does. Well, my cadences were okay, right? I don't need to worry about cadence. Well, actually, it does. All of these things, and don't go and blow your brain apart trying to do all of this on one ride. Choose one thing that you think will make you better. What is your linchpin right now? What is going to make you a better rider? It's not focusing on the absolute power. It's becoming more consistent, or building more tools into your toolbox, such as creating a more stiff and stable. We don't need balance work. That's another video. Actually, that's this week's podcast, which was released on January 7th here, is stability versus balance. And we don't need balance necessarily as cyclists, not the way you're training it. So make sure you pop over to the Strong Savvy Cyclist and Triathlete podcast and take a listen to that. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Do you do a 20-minute FTP, or will you be trying the HVT approach of doing 2x8, 2x10, or 2x12 minutes? Leave a comment down below with your answer, and I'll be sure to follow up with you. If you enjoyed this video and felt it was valuable in teaching you about strength training for cyclists and triathletes and how to get more out of your training, hit the like button, and please share this video with your friends and coaches. And if you want to have more training content, subscribe to my channel here, HVTraining. Now, don't forget to head over to the Human Vortex Training website to sign up for our free newsletter and to get your free gift of interval and why you might be able to get more out of your intervals. Now, train smarter, not harder, because it is all about you.